We got 1. We got 2. Buna to you too. I think this is the first one I've been able to maybe pronounce. Or feel like I can pronounce. I'm going to guess the other person is Stephen. And I'm going to go ahead and start. We left off. Both figured out that his new patron is being poisoned. We left off of there on that cliffhanger. And here's Louis, just in time. I'm not going to try to read what Stephen just commented. Chapter 60. Wisdom's Tool. The mayor's eyes went wide at my words, then narrowed again. Even in the midst of his infirmity, Alvaron's wit was sharp. You were right to speak that close and soft, he said. You are treading dangerous ground. But speak, I will hear you. Your Grace, I suspect Thrape did not mention in his letter that I am a student of the university as well as a musician. The mayor's eyes showed no glimmer of recognition. Which university? He asked. Oh, ni hao. There we go. I can say that. The university, Your Grace, I said. I am a member of the Arcanum. Alvaron frowned. You're far too young to make such a claim. And why would Thrape neglect to mention this? You were not looking for an arcanist, Your Grace, and there is a certain stigma attached to that sort of study this far east. It was the closest I could come to speaking the truth, that Vince are superstitious to the point of idiocy. The mayor blinked slowly, his expression hardening. Very well, he said. Perform some work of magic if you are what you say. Yeah, that's the worst, when your patron gets poisoned. I'm only an arcanist in training, Your Grace, but if you would like to see a bit of magic... I looked at the 3 lamps lining the walls, licked my fingers, concentrated, and pinched the wick of the candle sitting on his bedside table. The room went dark, and I heard his startled intake of breath. I brought out my silver ring, and after a moment it began to shine with a silver-blue light. My hands grew cold, as I had no source of heat other than my own body. That will do, the mayor said. If he was at all unnerved, there was no hint of it in his voice. I stepped across the room and opened the shuttered windows. Sunlight flooded the room. There was a hint of celas flower, a trill of bird song. I've always found that taking in some air is good for whatever troubles a body, though others disagree. I smiled at him. He didn't return it. Yes, you're very clever. Come here and sit. I did so, taking a chair near his bedside. Now explain yourself. I told Codicus I was compiling a collection of stories from the noble houses. Oh, sorry, I said. A handy excuse, as it also explains why I have been spending time with you. The mayor's expression remained grim. I saw pain blur his eyes like a cloud passing in front of the sun. Proof that you are a skilled liar hardly gains you my trust. A cold knot began to form in my stomach. I had assumed the mayor would accept the truth more easily than this. Just so, Your Grace. I lied to him, and I am telling you the truth. Since he thought me nothing more than idle lordling, he let me watch while he made your medicine. I held up the amber flask. The sunlight broke itself into rainbows on the glass. Alvaron remained unmoved, his normally clear eyes fogged with confusion and pain. I ask for proof, and you tell me a story. Codicus has been a faithful servant for 12 years. Nevertheless, I will consider what you've said. His tone implied it would be a short, unkind consideration. He held out his hand for the vial. I felt a small flame of anger strike up inside me. It helped to ease the cold fear settling in my gut. Your Grace wants proof? I want my medicine, he snapped, and I want to sleep. Please do. Your Grace, I can— How dare you interrupt me? Alvaron struggled to sit upright in his bed, his voice furious. You go too far. Leave now, and I may still consider retaining your services. He was trembling with rage, his hand still reaching for the vial. There was a moment of silence. I held out the vial, but before he could grasp it, I said, You have vomited recently. It was milky and white. The tension in the room rose sharply, but the mayor went motionless when he heard what I said. Your tongue feels thick and heavy. Your mouth is dry and filled with an odd, sharp taste. You have had a craving for sweets, for sugar. You wake in the night and find you cannot move, cannot speak. You are struck with palsy, with colic and unreasoning panic. As I spoke, the mayor's hand slowly drew away from the vial. His expression was no longer livid and angry. His eyes seemed unsure, almost frightened, but they were clear again, as if the fear had awakened some sleeping caution. Codicus told you, the mayor said, but he sounded far from certain. Would Codicus discuss the details of your illness with a stranger? I asked pointedly. My concern is for your life, Your Grace. If I must bruise propriety to say that, I will do so. Give me 2 minutes to speak, and I will give you proof. Alvaron gave a slow nod. I'm not going to claim to know exactly what this is. I gestured with the vial. But most of what is poisoning you is lead. This accounts for the palsy, the pain in your muscles and viscera, the vomiting and paralysis. I've had no paralysis. I looked him over with a critical eye. That's fortunate. But there is more than simply lead in this. I'm guessing this contains a goodly amount of ophium, which isn't exactly poisonous. What is it then? It's more of a medicine or a drug. Which is it then? He snapped. Poison or medicine? Has your grace ever taken laudanum? Once when I was younger, to help me sleep through the pain of a broken leg. Ophalum is a similar drug, but it is usually avoided as it is highly addictive. I paused. It is also called Denerim. The mayor grew paler at this, and in that moment his eyes grew almost perfectly clear. Everyone knew about the sweet eaters. I suspect he added it because you had been irregular about taking your medicine, I said. The ophalum would make you crave it while easing your pain at the same time. It would also account for your sugar craving, your sweats, and any odd dreams you've been having. What else did he put in here? I mused to myself. Probably stitch root or manum to keep you from vomiting too much. Clever. Horrible and clever. Not so clever. The mayor gave me a rictus smile. He didn't manage to kill me. I hesitated, then decided to tell him the truth. Killing you would have been simple, your grace. He could easily dissolve enough lead in this vial to kill you. I held it up to the light. Getting enough to make you sick without killing or paralyzing you, that is difficult. Why? Why poison me if not to kill me? Your grace would have better luck solving that riddle. You know more about the politics involved. Why poison me at all? The mayor sounded genuinely puzzled. I pay him lavishly. He is a member of the court in high regard. He has the freedom to pursue his own projects and travel when he wishes. He has lived here a dozen years. Why now? He shook his head. I tell you, it doesn't make sense. Money? I suggested. They say every man has a price. The mayor continued to shake his head. Then he looked up suddenly. No, I've just remembered. I fell ill long before Codicus began to treat me. He stopped to think. Yes, that's right. I approached him to see if he could treat my illness. The symptoms you mentioned didn't appear until months after he started treating me. It couldn't have been him. Lead works slowly in small doses, your grace. If he were going to poison you, he would hardly want you vomiting blood 10 minutes after you drank his medicine. I suddenly remembered who I was talking to. That was poorly said, your grace. I apologize. He nodded a stiff acceptance. Too much of what you say is too close to the mark for me to ignore. Yet still, I can't believe Codicus would do such a thing. We can put it to the test, your grace. He looked up at me. How is that? Order a half-dozen birds brought to your rooms. Sipquicks would be ideal. Sipquicks. Tiny, bright things, yellow and red. I held up my fingers about 2 inches apart. They're thick in your gardens. They drink the nectar from your salus flowers. Oh, we call them flits. We will mix your medicine with their nectar and see what happens. Oh, that's terrible. His expression grew bleak. If lead works slowly, as you say, this would take months. I'll not go without my medicine for months on some poorly supported fancy of yours. I saw his temper burning close to the surface of his voice. They weigh much less than you, your grace, and their metabolisms are much faster. We should see results within a day or two at most. I hope. He seemed to consider this. Very well, he said, lifting a bell from his bedside table. I spoke quickly before he could ring it. Might I ask your grace to invent some reason for needing these birds? A little caution would serve us well. I have known Stapes forever, the mayor said firmly, his eyes as clear and sharp as I had ever seen them. I trust him with my lands, my lockbox, and my life. I do not ever wish to hear you imply he is anything other than perfectly trustworthy. There was unshakable belief in his voice. I dropped my eyes. Yes, your grace. He rang the bell, and it was barely 2 seconds before the portly manservant opened the door. Yes, sir? Stapes, I miss being able to walk in the gardens. Could you find me a half-dozen flits? Flits, sir? Yes, the mayor said, as if he were ordering lunch. They're pretty things. I think the sound of them will help me sleep. I'll see what I can do, sir. Before he closed the door, Stapes scowled at me. After the door was shut, I looked at the mayor. Might I ask your grace why? To save him the trouble of lying. He hasn't the knack for it, and there is wisdom in what you said. Caution is always wisdom's tool. I saw a thin layer of perspiration covering his face. If I am correct, your grace, tonight will be difficult for you. All my nights are difficult of late, he said bitterly. What will make this one any worse than the last? Your ophalum, your grace. Your body is craving it. In 2 days you should be through the worst of it, but until then you will be in considerable discomfort. Speak plainly. There will be aching in your jaw and head, sweating, nausea, cramps, and spasms, especially in your legs and lower back. You may lose control of your bowels, and there will be alternating periods of intense thirst and vomiting. I looked down at my hands. I am sorry, Your Grace. Alvaron's expression was rather pinched by the end of my description, but he nodded graciously. I would rather know. There are a few things that will make it slightly more tolerable, Your Grace. He brightened a bit. Such as? Laudanum, for one, just a bit to ease your body's craving, and a few other things. Their names are unimportant. I can mix them into a tea for you. Another problem is that you still have a goodly deal of lead in your body that isn't going to go away on its own. This seemed to alarm him more than anything I'd said so far. Won't I simply pass it? I shook my head. Metals are insidious poisons. They become trapped in your body. Only by a special effort can we leach the lead away. The mayor scowled. Damn and bother. I hate leeches. It does. This is before they had those commercials. Medicines have always had side effects from the very beginning of time. A figure of speech, Your Grace. Only imbeciles and toad-eaters use leeches in this day and age. The lead needs to be drawn out of you. I thought about telling him the truth, that he would most likely never be rid of all of it, but decided to keep that bit of information to myself. Can you do it? I thought for a long moment. I am probably your best option, Your Grace. We are a long way from the university. I wager not 1 in 10 physicians here have any respectable training, and I don't know who among them might know Cauticus. I thought for a moment longer then shook my head. I can think of 50 people better suited to the job, but they are 1,000 miles away. I appreciate your honesty. Most of what I need I can find down in Severin Low. However, I trailed off, hoping the mayor would understand my meaning and save me the embarrassment of asking for money. He stared at me blankly. However, I will need money, Your Grace. The things you will need are not easy to come by. Oh, of course. He produced a purse and passed it to me. I was a little surprised to find the mayor had at least one well-stocked purse within easy arm's reach of his bed. Unbidden, I remembered my tirade to a tailor in Tarbian years ago. That was a lot of alliteration there. What had I said to him? A gentleman is never far from his purse? I fought down an inappropriate fit of laughter. Stapes returned shortly after that. In a surprising display of resourcefulness, he produced a dozen Sipquicks in a wheeled cage the size of a wardrobe. My word, Stapes, the mayor exclaimed as his manservant rolled the fine mesh cage through the doorway. You've outdone yourself. Where would it suit you best, sir? Just leave it there for now. I'll have Quoth move it for me. Stapes looked a trifle wounded. It's no trouble. I know you'd be glad to do it, Stapes, but I was hoping you would fetch me a fresh pitcher of apple draw instead. I think it might settle my stomach. Certainly. He hurried out again, closing the door behind him. As soon as the door was closed, I moved to the cage. The little gem-like birds darted from perch to perch with a blurring speed. Pretty things, I heard the mayor muse. I was fascinated with them as a child. I remember thinking how wonderful it must be to eat nothing but sugar all day. There were 3 feeders wired to the outside of the cage, glass tubes filled with sugar water. 2 of them had spouts shaped like tiny celis blooms, while the third was a stylized iris, the perfect pet for nobility. Who else could afford to feed their pet sugar every day? I unscrewed the tops of the feeders and poured a third of the mayor's medicine into each. I held out the empty vial to Alvaron. What do you normally do with these? He set it on the table near his bed. I watched the cage until I saw one of the birds fly to a feeder and drink. If you tell Stapes you want to feed them yourself, will it keep him from meddling with their food? Yes, he always does exactly as I tell him. Good. Let them drain the feeders before you refill them. They'll get a better dose that way, and we'll see results faster. Where do you want me to put the cage? He looked around the room, his eyes moving sluggishly. Next to the chest of drawers in the sitting room, he said finally. I should be able to see the cage from here. I carefully rolled the cage into the next room. When I returned, I found Stapes pouring the mayor a glass of apple draw. I made a bow to Alvaron. With your permission, Your Grace. He made a gesture of dismissal. Stapes, Quoth will be returning later this afternoon. Let him in, even if I happen to be sleeping. Stapes nodded stiffly and gave me another disapproving look. He may be bringing me a few things as well. Please don't mention it to anyone. If there is anything you require... Alvaron gave a tired smile. I know you would, Stapes. I am simply putting the boy to use. I would rather have you close at hand. Alvaron patted his manservant's arm, and Stapes looked mollified. I let myself out. I feel like he was able to just procure this cage of birds super easily because he seems to just be really awesome like that. Or he just had one lying around, who knows. My trip to Severn Low took hours longer than it needed to. Though I chafed at the delay, it was a necessary one. As I walked the streets, I caught glimpses of folk dogging along behind me. Butler jealousy. Yeah, that's kind of funny. I wasn't surprised. From what I had seen of the rumor-driven nature of the mayor's court, I expected to have a servant or two watching my errands in Severn Low. As I've said, the mayor's court was rather curious about me at this point, and you have no idea what lengths bored nobility will go to in order to nose about in other people's business. While the rumors themselves were of no concern to me, their effects could be catastrophic. If Codicus heard I had gone shopping through apothecaries after visiting the mayor, what steps would he take? Anyone willing to poison the mayor wouldn't hesitate to snuff me like a candle. So, to avoid suspicion, the first thing I did when I came to Severn was buy dinner. Good hot stew and rough bread. I was sick to death of elegant food that was milk warm by the time it made its way to my rooms. Afterward, I bought 2 tippling flasks, the sort normally used for brandy. Then I spent a relaxing half-hour watching a small traveling troupe perform the end of The Ghost and the Goose Girl on a street corner. They weren't Edema Rue, but they did a good job of it. The mayor's purse was generous to them when they passed the hat. Eventually, I found my way to a well-stocked apothecary. I bought several things in a nervous, haphazard manner. After I had everything I needed and a few things I didn't, I awkwardly made inquiries with the owner about what a man might take if he was having certain troubles in the bedroom. The chemist nodded seriously and recommended several things with a perfectly straight face. I bought a little of each, then made a bumbling attempt to threaten and bribe him into silence. By the time I finally left, he was insulted and thoroughly irritated. If anyone asked, he would be quick to tell the story of a rude gentleman interested in impotence cures. It was hardly something I was eager to add to my reputation, but at least there wouldn't be any stories making their way back to Codicus about my purchasing laudanum, dead nettle, bite-few, and other equally suspicious drugs. Lastly, I bought my loot back from the pawnter with an entire day to spare. It nearly emptied the mayor's purse, but it was my final errand. The sun was setting by the time I made my way back to the foot of the sheer. There were only a handful of options for making your way between Severn High and Severn Low. The most ordinary were the 2 narrow staircases that cut back and forth up the face of the sheer. They were old, crumbling, and narrow in places, but they were free, and therefore the usual choice for the common folk who lived in Severn Low. For those who didn't relish the thought of climbing 200 feet of narrow stairway, there were other options. The freight lifts were run by a pair of former university students. Not full arcanists, but clever men who knew enough sympathy in engineering to manage the rather mundane task of hauling wagons and horses up and down the sheer on a large wooden platform. For passengers, the freights cost a penny going up and a halfpenny going down, though you'd occasionally have to wait for some merchant to finish loading or unloading his goods before the lift could make its trip. Nobility didn't use the freights. The vintage suspicion of all things remotely arcane took them to the horse lifts. These were drawn by a team of 20 horses hitched to a complex series of pulleys. This meant the horse lifts were a little faster and cost a full silver 8-bit to ride. Best of all, every month or so, some drunk lordling would fall to his death from them, adding to their popularity by showing the breeding of the clientele. Since the money in my purse wasn't my own, I decided to use the horse lifts. I joined the 4 gentlemen and 1 lady who were already in line, waited for the lift to lower itself, then handed over my thin silver bit and stepped aboard. It was no more than an open-sided box with a brass rail running around the edge. Thick hempen ropes connected to the corners, giving it some stability, but any extreme motion set the thing swaying in a most disturbing fashion. A smartly dressed boy rode up and down with each load of passengers, opening the gate and signaling the horse drivers at the top when to begin their pull. It is the custom of the nobility to put their backs to Severn as they ride the lifts. Gawking was something common folk did. Not particularly caring what the nobles thought of me, I stood at the front rail. My stomach did peculiar things as we rose from the ground. Yeah, thank you for that comment. That's probably the comment of the night right there. Gonna pause and take that in. I watched Severn spread out below. It was an old city, and proud. The high stone wall circling it spoke of troubled times long past. It said much of the mayor that even in these peaceful times the fortifications were kept in excellent repair. All 3 of the gates were guarded, and they were closed at sundown every night. As the lift continued, I could see the different sections of Severn as clearly as if I were looking down on a map. There was a rich neighborhood, spaced with gardens and parks, the buildings all of brick and old stone. There was the poor quarter, the streets narrow and twisting, where all the roofs were tar and wooden shingles. At the foot of the cliff, a black scar marked where a fire had cut through the city at some point in the past, leaving little more than the charred bones of buildings. Too soon the ride was over. I let the other gentles disembark as I leaned against the railing, looking out over the city far below. "Sir?" the boy who rode the lift prompted wearily. "All off." I turned, stepped off the lift, and saw Denna standing in the front of the line. Before I had time to do anything other than stare in wonder, she turned and met my eyes. Her face lit. She cried my name, ran at me, and was nestled in my arms before I knew what was happening. I settled my arms around her and rested my cheek against her ear. We came together easily, as if we were dancers, as if we'd practiced it 1,000 times. She was warm and soft. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Her heart was racing, and I felt it thrilling against my chest. How? How is she everywhere? Yeah. I stood mutely as she stepped back from me. Only then did I notice an old bruise fading to yellow high on her cheek. Even so, she was the most beautiful thing I had seen in 2 months and 1,000 miles. "What are you doing here?" I asked. She laughed her silver laugh and reached out to touch my arm. Then her eyes flicked over my shoulder and her face fell. "Hold on," she cried to the boy who was closing the gate to the lift. "I have to catch this one or I'll be late," she said, her face full of pained apology as she stepped past me onto the lift. "Come find me." The boy closed the gate behind her and my heart fell as the lift began to... She's gone again. As the lift began to drop from sight. Where should I look? I stepped closer to the edge of the sheer, watching her fall away. She was looking up, her face white against the darkness, her hair a shadow in the night. "The 2nd Street north of Main, Tinnery Street." Shadow took her, and suddenly I was alone. I stood, the smell of her still in the air around me, the warmth of her just fading from my hands. I could still feel the tremor of her heart, like a caged bird beating against my chest. Alright, that was that chapter. Oh, this Denna thing is killing me. Okay. I don't know what's funnier, that she's everywhere, or your reactions to her being everywhere. That was the end of that chapter. Chapter 61. Dead Nettle. After my trip to Severin, I deposited my loot case in my room and made my way to Alberon's private rooms as quickly as possible. Stapes was not pleased to see me, but he showed me in with the same bustling efficiency as always. Alberon lay in a sweaty stupor, his bedclothes twisted around him. It was only then I noticed how thin he had grown. His arms and legs were stringy, and his complexion had faded from pale to gray. He glowered at me as I entered the room. Stapes arranged the mare's covers in a more modest fashion and helped him into a seated position, propping him up with pillows. The mare endured these ministrations stoically, and then said... Sorry, I thought I saw another comment pop up. Seeing things. Then said, "Thank you, Stapes," in a tone of dismissal. The manservant left slowly, giving me a decidedly uncivil stare. I approached the mare's bed and brought several items from the pockets of my cloak. "I found everything I needed, Your Grace, though not everything I hoped for. How do you feel?" He gave me a look that spoke volumes. "It took you a damn long time getting back. Caudicus came while you were away." I fought down a wave of anxiety. "What happened?" He asked me how I was feeling, and I told him the truth. He looked in my eyes and down my throat and asked me if I had thrown up. I told him yes, and that I wanted more medicine and to be left alone. He left and sent some over. I felt a panic rise in me. "Did you drink it?" "If you'd been gone much longer, I would have. And to hell with your fairy stories." He brought another vial from beneath his pillow. Sorry, I heard a noise from out... My cat did something out there. I heard a noise. He brought another vial from beneath his pillow. "I can't see what harm it could do. I can feel myself dying already." He thrust it toward me angrily. "I should be able to improve matters, Your Grace. Remember, tonight will be the most difficult. Tomorrow will be bad. After that, all should be well." "If I live so long as that," he groused. It was just the petulant grumble of a sick man, but it mirrored my thoughts so precisely that ice ran down my back. Earlier I hadn't considered that the mare might die despite my intervention. But when I looked at him now, frail and gray and trembling, I realized the truth. He might not live through the night. "First, there's this, Your Grace." I took out the tippling flask. "Brandy?" he said with muted anticipation. I shook my head and opened it. He wrinkled his nose at the smell and sank back onto the pillows. "God's teeth! As if my dying wasn't bad enough. Cod liver oil?" I nodded seriously. "Take two good swallows, Your Grace. This is part of your cure." He made no move to take it. "I've never been able to stomach the stuff, and lately I even vomit up my tea. I won't put myself through the hell of drinking it only to sick it back up." I nodded and restoppered the flask. "I'll give you something to stop that." There was a pot of water on the bedside table, and I began to mix him a cup of tea. He craned weakly to see what I was doing. "What are you putting in that?" "Something to keep you from being sick, and something to help you pass the poison out of your system. A bit of laudanum to ease your craving, and tea. Does your Grace take sugar?" "Normally, no, but I'm guessing it will taste like stump water without it." I added a spoonful, stirred, and handed him the cup. "You first," Alvaron said. Pale and grim, he watched me with his sharp gray eyes. He smiled a terrible smile. I hesitated, but only for a moment. "To your Grace's health," I said, and took a good swallow. I grimaced and added another spoonful of sugar. "Your Grace predicted it quite well. Stump water it is." He took the cup with both hands and began to drink it in a number of quick, determined sips. "Dreadful," he said simply, "but better than nothing. Do you know what a hell it is to be thirsty but not to be able to drink for fear of throwing up? I wouldn't wish it on a dog." "Wait a bit to finish it," I cautioned. "That should settle your stomach in a few minutes." I went into the other room and added the new vial of medicine to the Flitz feeders. I was relieved to see they were still sipping at the medicated nectar. I had worried they might avoid it due to a change in flavor or some natural instinct for self-preservation. I also worried that lead might not be poisonous to Sipquicks. I worried they might take a span to show any ill effects, not mere days. I worried at the mayor's rising temper. I worried at his illness. I worried at the possibility I might be wrong about everything I'd guessed. I returned to the mayor's bedside and found him cradling the empty cup in his lap. I mixed a second cup similar to the first, and he drank it quickly. Then we sat in silence for the space of 15 minutes or so. "How do you feel, Your Grace?" "Better," he admitted grudgingly. I detected a slight dullness to his speech. "Much better." "That is probably the laudanum," I commented. "But your stomach should be settled by now." I picked up the flask of cod liver oil. "2 good swallows, Your Grace." "Is this really the only thing that will do?" he asked distastefully. "If I had access to the apothecaries near the university, I could find something more palatable, but at the moment this is the only thing that can be done." "Get me another cup of tea to wash it down with." He picked up the flask, took 2 sips, and handed it back, his mouth turned down in a ghastly expression. I sighed internally. "If you're going to sip it, we will be here all evening. 2 solid swallows, the kind sailors use to drink cheap whiskey." He scowled. "Don't speak to me as if I were a child." "Then act the part of a man," I said harshly, stunning him to silence. 2 swallows every 4 hours. That whole flask should be finished by tomorrow." His gray eyes narrowed dangerously. "I would remind you who you are speaking to." "I am speaking to a sick man who will not take his medicine," I said levelly. Anger smoldered behind his laudanum-dulled eyes. "A pint of fish oil is not medicine," he hissed. "It is a malicious and unreasonable request. It can't be done." I fixed him with my best withering stare, and took the flask out of his hand. Without looking away, I drank the whole thing down. Swallow after swallow of the oil passed my gullet as I held the mayor's eye. Power move right there. I watched his face shift from angry to disgusted, then finally settle into an expression of muted, sickened awe. I upended the flask, ran my finger around the inside of it, and licked it clean. I pulled out a second flask from a pocket of my cloak. "This was going to be your dose for tomorrow, but you will need to use it tonight. If you find it easier, 1 swallow every 2 hours should suffice." I held it out to him, still holding his eyes with mine. He took it mutely, drank 2 good swallows, and stoppered the flask with a grim determination. Pride is always a better lever against the nobility than reason. I fished in one of the pockets of my rich burgundy cloak and brought out the mayor's ring. "I forgot to return this to you before, Your Grace." I held it out to him. He began to reach out for it, then stopped. "Keep it for now," he said. "You've earned that much, I imagine." "Thank you, Your Grace," I said, careful to keep my expression composed. He wasn't inviting me to wear the ring, but allowing me to keep it was a tangible step forward in our relationship. No matter how his courtship of the Lady Lackless went, I had made an impression on him today. I'm gonna start reading better right now. I poured him more tea and decided to finish his instructions while I had his attention. "You should drink the rest of this potful tonight, your grace, but remember, it's all you'll have until tomorrow. When you send for me, I'll brew you some more. You should try to drink as many fluids as you can tonight. Milk would be best. Put some honey in it and it will go down easier." He agreed and seemed to be easing towards sleep. Knowing how difficult his night would be, I let him nod off. I gathered my things before letting myself out. Stapes was waiting in the outer rooms. I mentioned to him that the mare was sleeping, and told him not to toss out the tea in the pot, as his grace would be wanting it when he woke up. As I left, the look Stapes gave me was not merely chilly, as it had been before. It was hateful, practically venomous. Only after he closed the door behind me did I realize what this must look like to him. He assumed I was taking advantage of the mare in his time of weakness. There are a great many such people in the world, traveling physicians with no qualms about preying on the fears of the desperately ill. The best example of this is Dead Nettle, the potion seller in Three Pennies for Wishing. Easily one of the most despised characters in all drama, there's no audience that doesn't cheer when Dead Nettle gets pilloried in the fourth act. With that in mind, I began to dwell on how fragile and gray the mare had looked. Living in Tarbean, I had seen healthy young men killed by Ophalum withdrawal, and the mare was neither young nor healthy. If he did die, who would be blamed? Certainly not Codicus, trusted adviser. Certainly not Stapes, beloved manservant. Me. They would blame me. His condition had worsened soon after I arrived. I didn't doubt Stapes would quickly bring to light the fact that I'd been spending time alone with the mare in his rooms, that I'd brought him a pot of tea right before he had a very traumatic night. At best, I would look like a young Dead Nettle. At worst, an assassin. Such was the turning of my thoughts as I made my way through the mayor's estate back to my rooms, pausing only to lean out one of the windows overlooking the Severn Low and vomit up a pint of cod liver oil. Chapter 62. Crisis. The next morning I made my way to Severn Low before the sun was up. I ate a hot breakfast of eggs and potatoes while I waited for an apothecary to open. When I was finished, I bought 2 more pints of cod liver oil and a few other oddments I hadn't thought of the day before. Then I walked the entire length of Tinnery Street, hoping to stumble onto Denna, despite the fact that it was far too early in the morning for her to be up and about. Wagons and farmers' carts vied for space on the cobbled streets. Ambitious beggars were laying claim to the busiest corners, while shopkeepers hung out their shingles and threw wide their shutters. I counted 23 inns and boarding houses on Tinnery Street. After making note of the ones Denna would probably find appealing, I forced myself back to the mayor's estates. Just someone walking by and just vomit on their head. This time I took the freight lifts, partly to confuse anyone following me, but also because the purse the mayor had given me was nearly empty. Since I needed to keep a formal face on things, I remained in my rooms, waiting for the mayor to send for me. I sent my card and ring to Braden, and soon he was sitting across from me, thrashing me at tack and telling stories. So the mayor had him hung in a gibbet? Right alongside the eastern gate, hung here for days, howling and cursing, saying he was innocent, saying it wasn't right and how he wanted a trial. I couldn't quite bring myself to believe it. A gibbet? Braden nodded seriously. An actual iron gibbet. Who knows where he managed to find one in this day and age? It was like something out of a play. I searched for something relatively non-committal to say. While it did sound grotesque, I also knew better than to openly criticize the mayor. "Well," I said, "banditry is a terrible thing." Braden began to place a stone on the board, then reconsidered. "Quite a few folks thought the whole thing was in rather," he cleared his throat, "bad taste. But nobody said so very loudly, if you catch my meaning. It was a grisly thing, but it got the point across." He finally chose the placement of his stone, and we played quietly for a time. Yeah, I didn't expect him to ask. A gibbet? I was just making sure I was pronouncing it right. It's a strange thing, I said. I ran into someone the other day who didn't know where Codicus would rank in the overall scheme of things. That's not terribly surprising, Braden gestured to the board. The giving and receiving of rings is a lot like tack. On the face of it, the rules are simple. In execution, they become quite complicated. He clicked down a stone, his dark eyes crinkling with amusement. In fact, the other day I was explaining the intricacies of the custom to a foreigner not familiar with such things. That was kind of you, I said. Braden gave a gracious nod. It seems simple at first glance, he said. A baron ranks above a baronet, but sometimes young money is worth more than old blood. Sometimes control of a river is more important than how many soldiers you can put to a field. Sometimes a person is actually more than one person, technically speaking. The Earl of Svannes is, by strange inheritance, also the Viscount of Tevin. One man, but two different political entities. I smiled. My mother once told me she knew a man who owed fealty to himself, I said. Owed himself a share of his own taxes every year, and if he were ever threatened, there were treaties in place demanding he provide himself with prompt and loyal military support. Braden nodded. It happens more often than folk realize, he said, especially with the older families. Stapes, for example, exists in several separate capacities. Stapes? I asked. But he's just a manservant, isn't he? Well, Braden said slowly, he is that, but he's hardly just a manservant. His family is quite old, but he has no title of his own. Technically, he ranks no higher than a cook, but he owns substantial lands. He has money. And he is the mayor's manservant. They've known each other since they were boys. Everyone knows he has Avalon's ear. Braden's dark eyes peered at me. Who would dare insult such a man with an iron ring? Go to his room and you will see the truth. There is nothing in his bowl but gold. Braden excused himself shortly after our game, claiming a prior engagement. Luckily, I now had my lute to occupy my time. I set about retuning it, checking the frets, and fussing over the tuning peg that was constantly coming loose. We had been away from each other for a long while, and it takes time to get reacquainted. Hours passed. I discovered myself absent-mindedly playing Dead Nettle's Lament, and forced myself to stop. Noon came and went. Lunch was delivered and cleared away. I retuned my lute and ran some scales. Before I knew it, I found myself playing Leave the Town, Tinker. Only then did I realize what my hands were trying to tell me. If the mayor was still alive, he would have called for me by now. I let the lute fall silent and began to think very quickly. I needed to leave. Now. Stapes had seen me bring medicine to the mayor. I could even be accused of tampering with the vial I had brought from Codicus's rooms. Slow fear began to knot my gut as I realized the helplessness of my situation. I didn't know the mayor's estates well enough to attempt a clever escape. On my way to Severn Low this morning, I'd gotten turned around and had to stop and ask directions. The knock on the door was louder than usual, more forceful than that of an errand boy who normally came to deliver the mayor's invitation. Of the errand boy. Guards. I froze in my seat. Would it be best to answer the door and tell the truth, or duck out the window into the garden and somehow try to make a run for it? The knock came again, louder. Sir? Sir? The voice was muffled by the door, but it was not a guard's voice. I opened the door and saw a young boy carrying a tray with the mayor's iron ring and card. I picked them up. The card had a single word written in a shaky hand. Immediately. Stapes looked uncharacteristically ragged around the edges and greeted me with an icy stare. Yesterday he looked as if he wanted me dead and buried. Today his look implied that simply buried would be good enough. The mayor's bedroom was generously decorated with celis flowers. Their delicate smell was almost enough to cover the odors they'd been brought in to conceal. Combined with Stapes' appearance, I knew my predictions of the night's unpleasantness had been close to the truth. Alvaron was propped into a sitting position in his bed. He looked as well as could be expected, which is to say exhausted, but no longer sweating and racked with pain. As a matter of fact, he looked almost angelic. A rectangle of sunlight washed over him, lending his skin a frail translucency and making his disarrayed hair shine like a silver crown around his head. Shine, not shrine. As I stepped closer, he opened his eyes, breaking the beatific illusion. No angel ever had eyes as clever as Alvaron's. "I trust I find your grace well?" I asked politely. "Passing fair," he responded, but it was mere social noise, telling me nothing. "How do you feel?" I asked in a more serious tone. He gave me a long look that let me know he did not approve of my addressing him so casually, then said, "Old. I feel old and weak." He took a deep breath. "But for all that, I feel better than I have in several days. A little pain, and I am mightily tired, but I feel clean. I think I've passed the crisis." I did not ask about last night. "Would you like me to mix you another pot of tea?" "Please." His tone was measured and polite. Unable to guess his mood, I hurried through the preparations and handed him his cup. He looked up at me after sampling it. "This tastes different. There is less laudanum in it," I explained. "Too much would be harmful to your grace. Your body would begin to depend on it as surely as it craved the ophalum." He nodded. "You'll note my birds are doing well," he said in an overly casual tone. I looked through the doorway and saw the Sipquicks darting about in their gilded cage, lively as ever. I felt a chill at the implication of his comment. He still didn't believe Codicus was poisoning him. I was too stunned to make a quick reply, but after a breath or two I managed to say, "Their health does not concern me nearly so much as your own. You do feel better, don't you, Your Grace?" "That is the nature of my illness. It comes and goes." The mayor set down his cup of tea, still 3/4 full. "Eventually it fades entirely, and Codicus is free to go off gallivanting for months at a time, gathering ingredients for his charms and potives. Speaking of," he said, folding his hands in his lap, "would you do me the favor of fetching my medicine from Codicus?" "Certainly, Your Grace." I stretched a smile over my face, trying to ignore the unease settling in my chest. I cleaned up the clutter I had created while fixing his tea, tucking packages and bundles of herbs back into the pockets of my burgundy cloak. The mayor nodded graciously, then closed his eyes and seemed to lapse back into his tranquil, sunlit nap. "Our fledgling historian," Codicus said as he gestured me inside and offered me a seat. "If you'll excuse me for a moment, I'll be right back." I sank into the padded chair, and only then noticed the array of rings on the nearby table. Codicus had gone so far as to have a rack built for them. Each was displayed with the name facing outward. There were a great many of them, silver, iron, and gold. Both my gold ring and Alvaron's iron one sat on a small tray on the table. I reclaimed them, taking note of this rather graceful way of wordlessly offering the return of a ring. I looked around the large tower room with muted curiosity. What possible motive could he have for poisoning the mayor? Barring access to the university itself, this place was every arcanist's dream. Curious, I got to my feet and wandered to his bookshelves. Codicus had a respectable library, with nearly 100 books crowding for space. I recognized many of the titles. Some were chemical references, some were alchemical. Others dealt with the natural sciences, herbology, physiology, bestiology. The vast majority seemed to be historical in nature. A thought occurred to me. Perhaps I could get the native vintage superstition to work to my advantage. If Codicus was a serious scholar, and even half as superstitious as a native vint, he might know something about the Chandrian. Best of all, since I was playing the dim-witted lordling, I didn't need to worry about damaging my reputation. Codicus came around the corner and seemed somewhat taken aback when he saw me standing by the bookshelves, but he rallied quickly and gave me a polite smile. "See anything you're interested in?" I turned, shaking my head. "Not particularly," I said. "Do you know anything about the Chandrian?" Codicus looked at me blankly for a moment, then burst out laughing. "I know they're not going to come into your room at night and steal you out of your bed," he said, wiggling his fingers at me the way you'd tease a child. "You don't study mythology, then?" I asked, fighting down a wave of disappointment at his reaction. I tried to console myself with the fact that this would firmly solidify me as a half-wit lordling in his mind. Codicus sniffed. "That's hardly mythology," he said dismissively. "One could barely even stoop to calling it folklore. It's superstitious bunk, and I don't waste my time with it. No serious scholar would." He began to putter around the room, restoppering bottles and tucking them into cabinets, straightening up stacks of papers and returning books to their shelves. "Speaking of serious scholarship, if I remember correctly, you were curious about the Lackless family." I simply stared at him for a moment. With everything that had happened since, I'd all but forgotten the pretense of the anecdotal genealogy I'd invented yesterday. "If it wouldn't be any trouble," I said quickly. "As I've said, I know practically nothing of them." Codicus nodded seriously. "In that case, you might be well served in considering their name." He adjusted an alcohol lamp underneath a simmering glass alembic in the midst of an impressive array of copper tubing. Whatever he was distilling, I guessed it wasn't peach brandy. "You see, names can tell you a great deal about a thing." I grinned at that, then fought to smother the expression. "You don't say." He turned back to face me just as I got my mouth under control. "Oh, yes," he said. "You see, names are sometimes based on other, older names. The older the name, the closer it lies to the truth. Lackless is a relatively new name for the family, not much more than 600 years old." For once I didn't have to feign amazement. 600 years is new? The Lackless family is old. He stopped his pacing and settled down into a threadbare armchair. Much older than the house of Alvaron. 1,000 years ago, the Lackless family enjoyed a power at least as great as Alvaron's. Pieces of what are now Vintus, Modeg, and a large portion of the small kingdoms were all Lackless lands at one point. "What was their name before that?" I asked. He pulled down a thick book and flipped its pages impatiently. "Here it is. The family was called Loaclos, or Lochlos, or Lolos. They all translate the same, Lockless. Spelling was rather less important in those days." "What days were those?" I asked. He consulted the book again. About 900 years ago, but I've seen other histories that mention the Loklos 1,000 years before the fall of Otur. I boggled at the thought of a family older than empires. So the Lockless family became the Lackless family? What reason could a family have for changing its name? There are historians who would cut off their own right hands to answer that, Codicus said. It's generally accepted that there was some sort of falling out that splintered the family. Each piece took on a separate name. In Autur they became the Lac-Qui family. They were numerous but fell on hard times. That's where the word lackey comes from, you know. All those paupered nobility forced to scrape and bow to make ends meet. In the south they became the Lackliths, who slowly spiraled into obscurity. The same with the Kapken in Modeg. The largest piece of the family was here in Vintus, except Vintus didn't exist back then. He closed the book and held it out to me. You can borrow this if you'd like. Thank you. I took the book. You're too kind. There was the distant sound of a belling tower. I'm too long-winded, he said. I've talked away our time and haven't given you anything of use. Just the history makes a great difference, I said gratefully. Are you sure I can't interest you in a few stories from other families? He asked, walking over to a work table. I wintered with the Jackus family not long ago. The Baron is a widower, you know, quite wealthy and somewhat eccentric. He raised both eyebrows at me, his eyes wide with implied scandal. I'm sure I could remember a few interesting things if I were assured of my anonymity. I was tempted to break character for that, but instead I shook my head. Perhaps when I'm done working on the Lackless section, I said, with all the self-importance of someone devoted to a truly useless project. My research is quite delicate. I don't want to get tangled up in my head. Codicus frowned a bit, then shrugged it away as he rolled up his sleeves and began to make the mare's medicine. I watched him go through his preparations again. It wasn't alchemy. I knew that from watching Simon work. This was barely even chemistry. Mixing a medicine like this was closer to following a recipe than anything. But what were the ingredients? I watched him move through it step by step. The dried leaf was probably bitefew. The liquid from the stoppered jar was no doubt muriatum or aquafortis, some sort of acid at any rate. When it bubbled and steamed in the lead bowl, it dissolved a small amount of lead, maybe only a quarter scruple. The white powder was probably the ophalum. He added a pinch of the final ingredient. I couldn't even guess what that was. It looked like salt, but then again, most everything looks like salt. As he went through the motions, Codicus nattered on about court gossip. De Fer's eldest son had broken his leg jumping out a brothel window. Lady Hessua's most recent lover was Yillish and didn't speak a word of Auturan. There was a rumor of highwaymen on the King's Road to the north, but there are always rumors of bandits, so that was nothing new. I mixed in some Mountain Dew. I don't care one whit for gossip, but I can fake interest when I must. All the while I watched Codicus for some telltale sign, some whisper of nervousness, a bead of sweat, a moment's hesitation. But there was nothing. Not the slightest indication that he was preparing a poison for the mare. He was perfectly comfortable, utterly at ease. Was it possible he was poisoning the mare by accident? Impossible. Any arcanist worth his gilder knew enough chemistry to... Then it dawned on me. Maybe Codicus wasn't an arcanist at all. Maybe he was simply a man in a dark robe who didn't know the difference between an alligator and a crocodile. Maybe he was just a clever pretender who happened to be poisoning the mare out of simple ignorance. Maybe that was peach brandy in his distillery. He tamped the cork into the vial of amber liquid and handed it to me. There you are, he said. Make sure you take it to him straight away. It'll be best if he gets it while it's still warm. The temperature of a medicine doesn't make one whit of difference. Any physicker knows that. I took the vial and pointed to his chest as if I'd just noticed something. My word, is that an amulet? He seemed confused at first, then drew out the leather cord from underneath his robes. Of sorts, he said with a tolerant smile. At a casual glance, the piece of lead he wore around his neck looked very much like an arcanum gilder. Does it protect you from spirits? I asked in a hushed voice. Oh, yes, he said flippantly. All sorts. I swallowed nervously. May I touch it? He shrugged and leaned forward, holding it out to me. I took it timidly with my thumb and forefinger, then jumped back a step. It bit me, I said, pitching my voice somewhere between indignation and anxiety as I wrung my hand. I saw him fighting down a smile. Ah, yes, I need to feed it, I suspect. He tucked it back inside his robes. Go on now. He made a shooing motion toward the door. I made my way back to the mayor's rooms, trying to massage some feeling back into my numb fingers. It was a genuine arcanum gilder. He was a real arcanist. He knew exactly what he was doing. I returned to the mayor's rooms and engaged in 5 minutes of painfully formal small talk while I refilled the Flitz feeders with the still warm medicine. The birds were unnervingly energetic, humming and chirruping sweetly. The mayor sipped a cup of tea as we talked, his eyes following me quietly from the bed. When my work with the birds was finished, I made my goodbyes and left as quickly as propriety allowed. Though our conversation hadn't touched on anything more serious than the weather, I could read his underlying message as plainly as if he'd written it for me to read. He was in control. He was keeping his options open. He didn't trust me. Alright, let me see. Should we do one more? I think we can. We can do one or two more. At least one more. Yeah, we'll do one more. Chapter 63, The Gilded Cage. After my brief taste of freedom, I was trapped in my rooms again. Though I hoped the mayor was through the worst of his recovery, I still needed to be at hand should his condition worsen, and he call on me. I couldn't justify even a brief trip to Severn Low, no matter how desperately I wanted to head back to Tinnery Street with the hope of meeting up with Denna. I don't know what that is. So I called on Braden and spent a pleasant afternoon playing tack. We played game after game, and I lost each one in new and exciting ways. This time, when we parted ways, he left the game table with me, claiming his servants were tired of carrying it back and forth between our rooms. In addition to talk with Braden and my music, I had a new distraction, albeit an irritating one. Codicus was every bit the gossip he seemed to be, and word had spread about my storied genealogy. So now, in addition to courtiers trying to pry information out of me, I was deluged with a steady flow of people eager to air everyone else's dirty laundry. I dissuaded those I could, and encouraged the especially rabid to write their stories down and send them to me. A surprising number of them took time to do this, and a stack of slanderous stories began to accumulate on a desk in one of my unused rooms. Oh, okay, cool. Sounds good. The next day, when the mayor summoned me, I arrived to find Alvaron sitting in a chair near his bed, reading a copy of Fiorin's Claim of Kings in the original Eld Vintic. His color was remarkably good, and I saw no trembling in his hands as he turned a page. He didn't look up as I entered the room. Without speaking, I prepared a new pot of tea with the hot water waiting at the mayor's bedside table. I poured a cup and set it at the table by his elbow. I checked the gilded cage in his sitting room. The Flitz darted back and forth to the feeders, playing dizzying aerial games which made them difficult to count. Still, I was reasonably certain there were 12 of them. They seemed none the worse despite 3 days of poisonous diet. I resisted an urge to knock the cage about a bit. Finally, I replaced the mayor's flask of cod liver oil and found it was still 3/4 full. Yet another sign of my fading credibility. Wordlessly, I gathered up my things and prepared to leave, but before I made it to the door, the mayor turned his eyes up from his book. "Kvoth?" "Yes, your grace?" "It seems I am not as thirsty as I thought. Would you mind finishing this for me?" He gestured to the untasted cup of tea that sat on the table. "To your grace's health," I said, and drank a sip. I made a face and added a spoon of sugar, stirred, and drained the rest of it with the mayor watching me. His eyes were calm, clever, and too knowing to be wholly good. Codicus let me in and ushered me into the same seat as before. "You'll excuse me for a moment," he said. "I have an experiment I must attend to, or I fear it will be ruined." He hurried up a set of steps that led to a different part of the tower. With nothing else to occupy my attention, I eyed... Sorry, my cat was suddenly messing with my feet, and that startled me. With nothing else to occupy my attention, I eyed his display of rings again, realizing that a person could make a fair guess at his position in the court by using the rings themselves as triangulation points. Codicus returned just as I was idly considering stealing one of his gold rings. "I was not sure if you wanted your rings back," Codicus said, gesturing. I looked back at the table and saw them resting on a tray. It seemed odd I hadn't noticed them before. I picked them up and slid them into an inner pocket of my cloak. "Thank you kindly," I said. "And will you be taking the mayor his medicine again today?" he asked. I nodded, puffing myself up proudly. When I nodded, the motion of my head made me dizzy. It was only then I realized the trouble. I had drunk a full cup of the mayor's tea. There hadn't been much laudanum in it, or rather not much laudanum if you were in pain and being slowly weaned away from a budding addiction to ophalum. However, it was quite a bit of laudanum for someone like myself. I could feel the effects of it slowly creeping over me, a warm lassitude running through my bones. Everything seemed to be moving a little more slowly than normal. "The mayor seemed eager for his medicine today," I said, taking extra care to speak clearly. "I'm afraid I don't have much time to chat." I was in no condition to play the half-wit gentry for any length of time. Codicus nodded seriously and retreated to his work table. I followed him as I always did, wearing my best curious expression. I watched with half an eye as Codicus mixed the medicine, but my wits were fuddled by the laudanum, and what remained were focused on other matters. The mayor was hardly speaking to me. Stapes hadn't trusted me from the beginning, and the Flitts were healthy as ever. Worst of all, I was trapped in my rooms while Denna waited down on Tinnery Street, no doubt wondering why I hadn't come to visit. I looked up, aware that Codicus had asked me a question. "Beg your pardon?" "Could you pass me the acid?" Codicus repeated as he finished measuring out a portion of leaf into his mortar and pestle. I picked up the glass decanter and began to hand it to him before I remembered I was just an ignorant lordling. I couldn't tell salt from sulphur. I didn't know what an acid was. I did not flush or stumble. I didn't sweat or stutter. I am a Demaroo born, and even drugged and fuddled, I am a performer down to the marrow of my bones. I met his eyes and asked, "This one, right? The clear bottle comes next?" Codicus gave me a long, speculative look. I flashed him a brilliant grin. "I've got a good eye for detail," I said smugly. "I watched you go through this twice now. I bet I could mix the mayor's medicine myself if I wanted to." I pitched my voice with all the ignorant self-confidence I could muster. This is the true mark of nobility, the unshakable belief that they can do anything. Tan leather, shoe a horse, spin pottery, plow a field, if they really wanted to. Codicus looked at me a moment longer, then began to measure out the acid. "I dare say you could, young sir." 3 minutes later I was walking down the hall with the warm vial of medicine in my sweaty palm. It almost didn't matter whether I'd fooled him or not. What mattered was that for some reason Codicus was suspicious of me. Stapes stared daggers into my back as he let me into the mayor's rooms, and Alvaron ignored me as I poured the new dose of poison into the Flit's feeders. The pretty things hummed about their cage with infuriating energy. I took the long way back to my rooms, trying to get a better feel for the layout of the mayor's estate. I already had my escape route half planned, but Codicus's suspicion encouraged me to put the finishing touches on it. If the Flitts didn't start dying tomorrow, it would probably be in my best interest to disappear from Severn as quickly and quietly as possible. Late that night, when I was reasonably sure the mayor wouldn't call on me, I slipped out the window of my room and made a thorough exploration of the gardens. There were no guards this late at night, but I did have to avoid a half-dozen couples taking moonlight strolls. There were two others sitting in close romantic conversation, one in a bower, the other in a gazebo. The last couple I nearly trod on while cutting through a hedgerow. They were neither strolling nor conversing in any conventional sense, but their activities were romantic. They didn't notice me. Eventually I found my way onto the roof. From there I could see the grounds surrounding the estate. The western edge was out of the question, of course, as it was pressed up against the edge of the sheer, but I knew there had to be other opportunities for escape. While exploring the southern end of the estate, I saw lights burning brightly in one of the towers. What's more, they had the distinctive red tint of sympathy lamps. Codicus was still awake. I made my way over and risked a look inside, peering down into the tower. Codicus was not simply working late. He was talking to someone. I craned my neck, but I couldn't see who he was speaking to. What's more, the window was leaded shut, and I couldn't hear anything. I was about to move to a different window when Codicus stood and began to walk to the door. The other person came into view, and even from this steep angle I could recognize the portly, unassuming figure of Stapes. Stapes was clearly worked up about something. He made an emphatic gesture with one hand, his face deathly serious. Codicus nodded several times in agreement before opening the door to let the manservant out. I noted Stapes wasn't carrying anything when he left. He hadn't stopped by for medicine. He hadn't stopped by to borrow a book. Stapes had stopped by in the middle of the night to have a private conversation with the man who was trying to kill the mayor. All right. I'm going to stop it there. We're really in the middle of, like, the meat of this book, I think. There's a lot of stuff happening. A lot of really interesting stuff. We're making a good way through it now. Getting pretty far. Making good time. Alright. Well, thanks as always for watching and listening. And I will continue this on Sunday night. Probably a little earlier than tonight, depending on you guys' schedules. Although I'm flexible. We'll figure it out. Good night.